time with them. Today, our next speaker is going to regale us with the story of him and his grandfather and challenge all of us to focus some time on the older people in our lives. If you do, you will be truly blessed. Let's welcome former Toastmaster of the Year, Toastmaster Tim Taylor, with his speech titled, "The Trip of a Lifetime, or How I Really Got to Know My Grandfather."
Thank you. I stood in front of a packed house at a little church in McCool, Mississippi. I was honored to be chosen to give the eulogy at my grandfather's funeral. James Kyle had 4 kids. He grew up before the Depression, and he only had a 6th grade education. By the end of his life, he was the mayor of his small town. He was also the constable. He collected the water bills. He basically did everything. He was a local legend. What do you say about a guy that's lived so long and had such a colorful life? Again, I was so honored to be asked. He had 4 kids, 10 grandkids, and at that time, 19 great-grandkids. There was no pressure, of course. And I gave this talk years before I joined Toastmasters. Looking back, I believe it was the best talk I ever gave. I wanted this eulogy to mostly be a celebration of his life. So I told a story about him, and he just impressed me so much with his life. A few months before his death, I was at a Christian conference, and there was a speaker there, and he talked about, went to see his mother one day, and he just said off the top of his head, he said, "Mom, what would you like to do before you die?" And she was from Venezuela, and she said, "I would like to get all my brothers and sisters and go back to the little home that we grew up in Venezuela." And he had, again, there were 8 of them. He took every one of them back there, and they went to the little home they all grew up in. They all cried, and they remembered where their mother made their dinners, made their dinners every day. And he told this story. Again, this was a Christian conference. Every one of them, and some of them were in their 70s and 80s, ended up becoming a Christian after this event. And he said all they talked about while they were there was that their kids would never do something like that for them. And it was incredible. So a few months later, I found myself in Mississippi visiting my grandfather, and suddenly that story came to my mind. And I said to him, "Grandpa, what would you like to do before you die?" He was 80 years old. And he immediately knew what he wanted to do. He said, "I'd like to go back to this horse farm where I bought a horse in 1968 in New Mexico." And I said to him immediately, I just said, "You know what? I don't know when we're going to do this, but we're going to do it." Again, a few months later, I found myself renting a car, driving all the way to Mississippi, and picking him up. There was a million reasons not to do this. At that time, I had 2 kids. I was extremely busy, and he was a heart patient. And so I was like, you know what? This is the right thing. This is the right thing that I need to do. So this was before GPS, the internet. We had a Rand McNally roadmap and a vague idea of where this place was. So we just got in the car and took off. We stopped where we wanted to, we ate where we wanted to, we found little motels to sleep in at night, and it was an incredible trip. I'll never forget, my grandfather was a very colorful guy. He talked constantly. I don't know where I got that, but he talked constantly, and all he talked about was his family, his kids, his grandkids, his great-grandkids. He knew everything about them. He knew everything that all of them were doing, the things they were involved in. It was unbelievable. He had a photographic memory. And I remember one funny thing that happened. We were driving along this little country road, and he said, "Tim, you know, you can always tell when one man's property stops and another man's property starts because the fence will change. The type of fence along the road will change." A little while later, we pulled up on the freeway. Now, this is a man that had hardly been out of the county he was born in his entire life. So a little while later, we pulled up on the freeway. And you know, the fence along the freeway is the same for, hundreds of miles sometimes. So we pulled on the freeway, and he looked out the window at that fence. And a little while later, we drove a little mile longer. He looked out the window at that fence. And then finally, he turned to me and he said, "Tim, man, this guy's got a big place. So we drove through Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas before we got to New Mexico. And every day he drove at least 4 hours every day so I could get a little rest. At that time in his life, he was a goat farmer. He used to be a dairy farmer. Now he was raising goats. And I think we stopped at every goat farm between Mississippi and New Mexico. I think that was one of his favorite parts of the trip. He would talk, if the goat farmer was out there, he would talk to him, and they just had incredible things in common. It was so much fun. We went along our way, we stopped at Carlsbad Caverns National Park. Who's been there? If you go down, you get in an elevator, you go down 10 stories, and this giant cave is there. It's as big as a stadium. It was unbelievable. And I remember when we got on the elevator, he grabbed the back of my belt. I think he was scared. And we got all the way to the bottom. We walked out. There was a park ranger there, and he goes, "This thing's going back up in a few minutes, isn't it?" But again, my favorite part of the trip was hearing his stories. This was the early days of video cameras. I videoed the entire trip. I've got it all on YouTube. If anybody wants to watch it, they're welcome to do that. And several times I would just sit there and listen to his stories and videotape him. I'd hold the camera like this. He didn't really know it was on. And his kids, I've sent it to all of them, and they've watched it 100 times. It was amazing. My grandfather was really great at sales. I know that's where I got my ability and speaking. He told me he had a 6th grade education. I never knew him to have a real job. He always just bought and sold things. In the country, what you do if you want to sell something, you just put it out in your front yard. So if there's a piece of farm equipment, whatever, you put out in the front yard. He would pull up and say, "Oh, let me take this old thing off your hands, blah, blah, blah." And then he would take it home and clean it up. And then he would sell it for a good profit. And he told me, he said, "Tim, you can sell anything. You could sell a redheaded stepchild if you just clean it up and brag on it." So, we never did find the ranch where his friend was. We went to some towns and asked, and he actually had the guy's name wrong. But he lived to be 93 years old. And my mother told me that he talked about that trip for the rest of his life. It meant that much to him. So I want to challenge you today. Do you have some seasoned citizens in your life? They are a fantastic resource and often overlooked. You have relatives. You have neighbors down the street. Don't forget about them. Do something with them. And I'll ask you, when you're standing in front of a eulogy, what would you say about one of your best friends? And Roy, I'd like to know what you're doing tomorrow for lunch. We can go to the mall and get a Maalox malt. Miss Toastmaster.